to have Ibrahim Shikaki from the economics department at Trinity College here with us today for Policy Parlor with Bucknell Institute of Public Policy. Ibrahim studied at the New School for Social Research in New York, and prior to pursuing his PhD, he worked with local and international institutions conducting economic and policy research in Palestine. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely.
In your paper, The Political Economy of Dependency and Class Formation in the Occupied Palestinian Territories Since 1967, you argue that dependency and class formation are crucial to understanding the economic situation in Palestine. Can you elaborate on this claim and explain how these factors have shaped the current Palestinian economic landscape?
Absolutely. So I think, the entry point for me has been kind of the inability of the standard or neoclassical approach to really shed light on the economics of Palestine, on the political economy of Palestine, even on the politics of Palestine. And so, standard theory normally tells you that if you have a strong economy and you have a weak economy and they have some relations between them, what you will have is a spillover of positive effects. And so, this has been translated throughout the last 30, 40 years in the idea of economic peace. So all what you need to do is bring in these business people from Palestine, from Israel, putting them together, and that profit motive, it will work in its miraculous way to make sure that technology transfers, that you can have specialization, and what you will have is a convergence. Clearly, what we see not only in the last 50 years, but if you look at it in terms of the last 100 years, even before the establishment of the State of Israel, looking at the Jewish economy and the Arab-Palestinian economy, that has not been the case. And so I think dependency theory is useful in several ways. The first way is understanding that this is capitalism. And so when you have an economic system, that is, I always tell my students, it's called capitalism, not laborism, for a reason. When you have that conflict, capital always triumphs. And so what you have had in terms of economic relations between Palestinian and Israeli economy has always been the focus of Israeli capital coupled with Palestinian labor. And so what that has meant is that value added has always been concentrated in the Israeli economy. And so you see that through Palestinian labor working in Israel. In the 1980s, that was around 40% of the Palestinian labor force. But it's not only that, you also see it in subcontracting as well. So you have Palestinian producers who are basically subcontracting for Israelis. And so the result of that type of relationship, that under dependency theory kind of there are several ways to understand dependency theory, but I think one manifestation of that is that you do find these resources, human, natural resources, moving from that poor periphery economy to the core, to the Israeli economy. And then on the other hand, you have goods moving the other way around. So you have finalized goods, high value added goods moving from the Israeli economy to the Palestinian one. And eventually what that does is it destroys completely the productive capacity of the Palestinian economy. So now we are seeing that completely. It is also leading to a skyrocketing trade deficit, which we also see as well. So I think economically, you're kind of seeing the manifestation of dependency, but I think even politically, it is useful. Dependency theory is useful as a framework because part of that is talking about a segment of society, right? The comprador, a segment of society that actually has their from one aspect, the resources that the Israeli economy kind of uses is kind of coupled with a segment of Palestinian society that has interests aligned with those of Israelis. So I think both from an economic perspective and from a political perspective, it's useful to look at dependency. And finally, I would say, again, that class formation, transformation is very important. So the vast majority of Palestinians used to be self-employed in agriculture, and that shifted into wage labor from Israel. And that also created a lot of dynamics that you would not be able to really understand and look into through the standard mainstream approach.
Yeah. Going off on that, in 1992, economist Wayne Godley made some statements about the implications of common currency in Europe. And he stated if a country gives up or loses its power, referring to its currency, it acquires the status of a local authority or colony. How does this perspective relate to Palestine's situation? And do you think Palestine can be viewed as a colony in similar terms?
I mean, it absolutely can, and the reasons for that really are, political slash legal. So what you had in the early 1990s was a political process, right? Peace process between the Palestinian Liberation Organization, representing the Palestinian people, and the State of Israel. In 1994-95, you had an agreement signed, so it was called the Oslo II Agreement, and there was an economic annex that was part of that agreement, referred to as the Paris Protocol because it was signed in Paris. Now, the Paris Protocol is basically the guiding principle for the economic relations between the Palestinians and the Israelis. It talks about several things, including labor, trade. It also talks about monetary aspects. So one of the articles states very clearly that Palestinians cannot have their currency, right? I mean, there's a stipulation there that unless this is agreed by what is called the JEC, the Joint Economic Committee. And the Joint Economic Committee has not met in 20 years, so nothing is happening over there. But I think this is very important because not only did you not have a currency, even the monetary authorities, normally, you have central banks, you have the Fed here, you have European Central Bank. In Palestine, we do not have a central bank. We have something like a quasi-central bank that's called the Palestinian Monetary Authority. And so because it doesn't have any control over currency, that means it doesn't have a local currency. There's very little direct monetary policy that it can have. One of the main tools is interest rates. It's very difficult to have interest rate control if you don't have a currency. So we do have in Palestine right now three currencies that are used. We have the Israeli shekel, we have the Jordanian dinar, and we have the US dollar. And each is used for certain things. But what that means is that each of those kind of relies on the central bank of that particular country, which means there's less and less to do in terms of monetary policy. Now, the Paris Protocol did have, at that time, and we have to keep in mind that this was meant as an interim, right? All the Oslo Accord were meant as an interim. It was a 5-year thing, and then in 1999, you sit down and you agree, and supposedly, even though it's not stated, but this is what the Palestinians would say, we were going towards statehood. It did have so if you look generally at the Paris Protocol, it basically put on paper what already existed, right? So it kind of entrenched the dependencies that were created. There were aspects of it that were novel, that gave the Palestinian Authority some control, and those had to do with fiscal policy. So now there was an entity called the Palestinian Authority that was able to get taxes. Unfortunately, the vast majority of tax revenues that the Palestinian Authority receives is what we call clearance revenue, right? So because Palestinians don't have control over borders, what you have is all the kind of, import-export happening at Israeli ports, which then meant that, according to the Paris Protocol, on a monthly basis, the Israelis should transfer that clearance revenue, which is around 80% of the tax revenue of the Palestinian Authority, back to the Palestinian Authority. It has not been doing that. And what it has been doing, again, talking about this colonial kind of enclave, if you want, what it has been doing is it has been using that as economic blackmail. So when the Palestinians go to the United Nations and say, we want our state, the Israelis say, you know what, we're going to take 20% of that money that you. When Palestinians, through the Social Affairs Ministry, is giving money to the families of Palestinians who are in Israeli prisons, they say, no, you cannot do that. We're going to take 20% of that. Palestinians don't have the ability to generate their own electricity, so we buy electricity, the vast majority of it, from Israel. Israel says, you know what, we're going to take part of that money and we're going to pay the Israeli electricity company because you owe them this and this and much. So that only really, if you think about it, the only positive thing that came out of the Paris Protocol is now completely used as this economic blackmail tool by the Israelis.
Yeah. Um, going along with that, my next question was very similar. So if you just have anything else to add, but as we were talking about, Palestine doesn't have its own currency. You elaborate on the reasons behind that, especially in the Oslo Agreement.
Yep.
And yeah, can you discuss any other economic challenges that this causes beyond just the policy?
Well, I mean, the only thing that I would add is that, maybe that somebody listening to this might say, well, okay, then that means the best thing for Palestinians now in terms of this limited monetary policy, which, given what's going on right now, is obviously not the key thing that we as Palestinians are interested in. But you could be faulted by saying, well, okay, then we just need a Palestinian currency. And there have been a lot of studies about that as well, the way that Palestinians are able to finance. So, one, in terms of actually having a currency, second, in terms of issuing debt, especially in other currency. But there are a lot of studies that the real economic conditions for that do not kind of exist right now, and I think that's part of the political economy aspect, right? I mean, I go back to standard economic theory because it's kind of devoured from that political aspect. It's very, sometimes when you read a lot of this that's work that's done on Palestine, you're kind of saying, well, it's really forgetting the main thing that is happening here. And again, that has to do with the Israeli project and kind of the implications, economic and politically, on the Palestinian people.
Yeah. Also, in your paper, kind of going along with that, you mentioned the open bridges policy implemented in Israel, and argue, as we were kind of talking about, that marked the beginning of the center periphery, like export oriented trade model for Palestine. Can you explain how this specific policy changed the Palestinian economy and the long term effects?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that would be like another important part of the Paris Protocol, which has to do with trade. In fact, this is not something that the Paris Protocol or even the Israeli military orders that were set in the West Bank and Gaza Strip after 1967. This actually goes back to the British Mandate of Palestine. And so very early on, the British Mandate had set policies to give preference to Jewish industries versus Arab Palestinian. Again, this is before the establishment of the State of Israel. And part of the policies, they had several policies. Some of them had to do with agricultural taxes, with pushing Palestinians out of their land. But one of the policies was a tariff trade policy. And what the British Mandate did was this: they said, all Jewish industries, so particularly at that time, cement and chemicals were kind of very important Jewish industries. We're going to put very high tariffs on that. And so what they're doing is they're protecting the Jewish industries there. On the other hand, and this relates directly to your question, what they did in terms of the industries that were dominated by Arab Palestinians, particularly agriculture, they had this open bridge policy. So basically anything can come in. And so now Palestinian farmers, and particularly those who are also working in like very simple agro industries, they had to face all of the competition above. And what this did, in the 20, 30 years of the British Mandate from 1922 to 1948, was completely shift the weight of the Jewish economies versus the Arab economies completely, in terms of the weight of the total production, but also in terms of capital investment. And so these are policies that were implemented almost 100 years before, but they are still they were used by the Israeli occupation after 1967. It's very interesting that so after 1967, the occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, basically that meant that those Palestinian territories were governed by Israeli military law, right? It's an occupation, so you have military law. Some of the first military laws that were set were economic. Some of the first military laws were close all the banks. Imagine that. Some of the first military orders were putting restrictions on applications for Palestinian new industries, putting restriction on Palestinians importing machinery. And so it was very clear that part of what you want to do is kill that Palestinian economy, particularly any part that might compete with Israeli industries.
Yeah. And wrapping up, you also discuss this at the very end of your paper. And in recent years, Palestine has increased its dependency on international aid and private credit. So, what are the consequences of this shift, and how has it affected Palestine's political and economic autonomy?
Very much so. So let's put ourselves in the early 1990s, right? Before that, the Israeli state, the Israeli occupation, was responsible for the welfare and well-being of the Palestinian people. Right? There was no Palestinian body, there was no Palestinian entity. Now, after 1993, 94, you have the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. De facto, and I say de facto because the international lawyers don't get on my back, because de jure, under international law, even now, it is still the role of the occupation to ensure the welfare and well-being of the people under occupation. But at least de facto, that responsibility shifted to the Palestinian Authority. So now you have this body, this Palestinian body, that is responsible for everything: education, health, all of these services. That responsibility transferred. But what did not transfer is control over policy, is control over resources, is control over borders. So you have now this gap. You have very large financial shoes to fill. And the Palestinian Authority didn't have any resources. So here comes international aid to the rescue. And so that's the part where there became a new dependency. If you say, up until the 90s, you had a dependency on the labor market, you had a dependency on the goods market. Now you have a new dependency on international aid. And somebody might say, well, maybe that's not bad. You have international aid, you can invest. But if you look at the data, and one thing that we economists like to look at is what portion of investment gross fixed capital formation, fancy word for investment, what percentage of that is investment in buildings versus non-buildings? And what you find is, with that international aid, nothing changed. The vast majority of investment, quote unquote, is investment in real estate, in buildings, not tradable goods that might have the long-term impact. Similarly with private debt, and this is particularly after 2007, I believe there were some changes in the laws. And what happened is private debt increased. And again, you might say, well, maybe that's a good thing. These Palestinian investors are taking credit and then they're creating job opportunities. Well, you look at where that debt is going, and the vast majority of it is going for consumption. And if you're talking about consumption in a country that doesn't produce, that means buying from Israel. And so with all the money that comes to Palestine from those Palestinians who work in the Israeli economy, it's being recycled back, because the only way that purchasing power can go someplace is go to Israeli goods that are going back. And so these are new dependencies that were created after the Palestinian Authority existed, both international aid, absolutely on a governmental level, which has been, and with this, it's also important to understand that aside from the 20-30% of Palestinians, given the time, who work in the Israeli economy, you also had a 20 to 25% of the Palestinian labor force working with the PA, so in the public sector. Now, the public sector relies completely on international aid to pay those public works. So if you now don't have international aid, which has been the case in the last years, international aid has, for a variety of reasons, declined. What you have is also Palestinians in the public sector not receiving their incomes. And so for the last, I'd say, 15 years, what's been going on is month by month, the Palestinian Authority will put something in the news: we're going to pay 70%. We have money to pay 80% of, for these 2-3 months, we're not going to be able to pay the Palestinian. So it's also important to understand that even when we look at unemployment rates in Palestine, which are very high, 30 and 40% at times, I think that's even underestimating the real unemployment rates, because you have that large proportion working in the Israeli economy and working in the public sector, which directly relies on international aid. And so if these two external things become weak, that unemployment rate can jump much, much higher.
Thank you so much for being with us today. This was a very interesting conversation.